Hi, so today I thought I would do another read from Nathaniel Mackey's Eroding Witness and refer to a few of the musical compositions that he mentions in the poems. It's just a nice way of reading the poems alongside the musical compositions and kind of think through how they are linked with each other and what's the significance of those linkings. And Mackey's poetry in particular is very significant for me, exciting for a number of reasons. Um, One of them being that he looks back towards Charles Olson's poetic practice and kind of thinks through a remaking of the American World poem, and that is quite interesting for me. And for Mackey in particular, the American jazz musical tradition is a very significant part of this remaking, um, uh, you know, creating a world poem, so to speak. So that is interesting to take note of. And I just thought I would just do a very quick kind of leap from Mackey to Prynne towards the end of the poetic reading and kind of talk about how Prynne is Prynne also looks at musical traditions, but he does it for the purpose of um, breaking off poetic utterance from the site of origin, that is the mouth. Um, so that is a very curious way in which he looks towards musical compositions, atonal musical compositions, for instance, and kind of makes them into a structural correlate for a poetic utterance which is removed from its site of origin, that is the mouth. So an atonal musical composition becomes the ideal way of talking about a poem that can no longer be brought back to the site of utterance, to the subjective self, to the mouth. So those are the kind of things that I have in mind when I am reading Mackey and kind of thinking about how Mackey is in very many ways connected to other poetic traditions which also look at music and musical structures and break down of musical structures and what all of that signifies. So I'm just going to read from the poem called Capricorn Rising, and it's for Pharaoh Sanders. I wake up mumbling, I am not at the music's mercy. Think damned if I'm not, but keep the thought to myself. Sweet mystic beast on the outskirts of earth, unruly airs, an awkward birth, bruises the bell of its horn. Life after life, each like it was endlessly yet to arrive, yet already there, a thin bread of duress, a sea-weary drift of boat-lifted Haitians, the hiss of the sea, whispering words of power, pinkish kef-pesh tools, parse the lips of the dead, lacking teeth, but licking the air for some taste of heaven, hungered by its name. What of it I refuse? Forks an angel's tongue. What of it I refuse? Awakes the wide-eyed stone. So this is dedicated to Pharaoh Sanders, and if you kind of look at the poem, there is a certain spiritual quality to it. There is a way of linking the present with the past, a coherent kind of thread connecting the present with the past, and suddenly the present as the site of writing the poem to the past of perhaps um, the coagulated musical traditions that inform this present writing. So that is very significant, and I would just kind of make for a listening of Pharaoh Sanders' Harvest Time. It's a beautiful piece, actually. I'm not sure if the microphone is catching the composition as well as I would like it to. Um, but it is called Harvest Time, and it is worth listening to this particular composition, especially in order to understand Mackey's poetic practice. Um, so there is, so let's listen to it a bit more, and then I will kind of talk a little. Okay, so that was Pharoah Sanders, and uh, Sanders himself is a very is a composer with a certain penchant for spirituality. So that is important to take note of. And I suppose one of the things that speaks to me about the poem is Mackey's own Mackey's own um, theoretical projections about how his poetry is to be read. So he says that poetry is meant to be read as a productive kind of dissonance. Um, and so he gives the example of the sound made by the wood on which the weaving loom is kept, and that becomes a metaphor for the noise on which the sound of the poem is created or generated. And there is a certain way in which his poetry is actually bringing the reader back to the um, foundations of the noise. Um, it's it's an anti-foundational way of going back to the roots of noise. So that is quite an interesting kind of argument that Mackey makes about his poetry. Um, but what strikes me the most about his writings is that there is a certain constant preoccupation with the mouth as a site of utterance, and the mouth being the muthos, or in Greek, what you mean, the speech. Um, that is a constant preoccupation throughout, and um, language, writing, narrative, forms of making history brings the sound back to the locus of utterance, brings the sound back to the site where sound becomes word. So that is what Mackey is doing consciously. And as I mentioned with regards to Prynne, there is a certain direct force with which he is kind of breaking the poem from returning back to that particular site of utterance. So that is a very interesting kind of cross connection to be built. Interesting to read Mackey alongside Prynne, or have Prynne in mind while reading Mackey. So I'm going to read Song of the Andumbulu, um, Song 1. The song says, "The dead will not ascend without song." That because if we lure them, their names get our throats, the word sticks. As not more than a week before when we did, that it read they would return, turn out one day our mouths. Touch, tutor me, teach me this thirst. Then in the eighth book warned of a sea that it brings them in, that, born of waves, a wash of words inside our throats, its bottomless voices, brew of stems, turns our insides out. Or like these new ones, they would explain these others, fish that walk on land. The signs are old men drunk on sidewalks, mumblers. The dead, they say, are dying of thirst, not even words, except it says itself for days in your head. And that voice, the book says, drinks blood, but will tell you the dead don't want us bled, but to be sung. And she said the name, and she said the same, a thin wisp of soul. But I want the meat of my body sounded, drummed. I put in, played upon by hands, hers made a priest of. Faces run out by water, features waste and reappear. Boat houses haunt the fog, horns gossip, heads nod, maracas, emptied out of all but seeds. So that is Song of the Andambulu. Um, I suppose one of the significant instances of reading myth into this poem is by thinking about the Dogon African tradition and the various um, ways in which Mackey wants to make the orality of the poem connect with the oral tradition of Dogon poetry. So that is something he is doing um, consciously. And I suppose, as I was saying earlier, there is a way in which the poetry is leading us back to the originary noise. At least that is what he is arguing in his theory. And of course, that is an engagement that is present in his poetry. And I suppose this is something which is written by Ernest Bornemann in The Roots of Jazz, where he says that African tradition itself is striving against regularity. So African musical tradition is going against the structure of regularity, of pitch, of time, of timbre, of vibrals. So that is the foundational structure for Mackey's poetry, and that is important to take into account. This structure, which is constantly negating itself, is the um, framework, if you like, if you can call it a framework. It's the skeleton for the poetic composition, a poetic composition that negates structurality. So that is important to take note of. And in my next reading, I will read J.H. Prynne's poem As Mouth Blindness, and kind of read that alongside certain atonal musical compositions, and see how they kind of speak to each other and inflect each other. So that's all for today.